The glass burned against her palm, but she couldn't pull away from witnessing this erasure of everything she knew. 6 months had passed since they'd laid James to rest in the frozen earth. 6 months of watching their carefully built life disintegrate like poorly mixed mortar, crumbling under pressure she couldn't withstand alone. Behind her, the kitchen held fragments of warmth from their dwindling wood supply, and even thinner reserves of optimism. The walls chinked with mud and moss that James had applied during their hopeful first autumn seemed to contract with each Arctic blast. Pine smoke mingled with the watery scent of soup stretched too far, a constant reminder of how desperately their circumstances had declined since her husband's capable hands had last tended this harsh land. 15-year-old Sarah moved through evening chores with mechanical precision that belonged on someone twice her age. Her once bright face now bore creases of worry and premature responsibility, the carefree joy of adolescence sacrificed to family survival. She stirred their meager supper with economical movements, understanding that every motion had to serve a purpose, when resources were counted in spoonfuls rather than portions. 12-year-old Daniel hunched over a split bridle at their handmade table, small fingers working leather beyond reasonable salvage. But replacement costs were impossible, so the boy labored with heartbreaking determination, his young frame carrying burdens that should have rested on grown shoulders with experience and strength to bear such weight without being crushed. 7-year-old Tommy played in whispered silence near the stone hearth wooden animals, arranged in careful patterns James had carved during evenings when their future seemed secure. Now the child's games were conducted in hushed tones that wouldn't disturb adults wrestling with problems beyond solution, wouldn't draw attention when there wasn't enough of anything to share. Spread across the table like a death warrant lay the final notice from Kelridge's First National Bank. The expensive paper mocked their poverty with its quality, but red-stamped words carried tombstone finality, final demand, payment due. This week, no further extensions. Morton Kelridge's signature sprawled with arrogant flourishes, belonging to someone who'd never wondered about his next meal or felt children's futures weighing on decisions that couldn't afford mistakes. 20 years. James's family had worked this unforgiving patch of wilderness for 2 decades, carving existence from land that destroyed the weak and unprepared. 20 years of surviving drought, flood, disease, market collapse, the endless parade of disasters that scattered lesser families like leaves before autumn storms. Now it could all vanish because a banker decided a widow with 3 children represented unacceptable risk rather than deserving compassion. The sound cutting through winter's assault was unmistakably human. 3 deliberate knocks against the barn door, spaced with patient rhythm, suggesting someone accustomed to requesting rather than demanding entry. The knocks repeated, measured, and respectful, carrying authority that turned Martha's blood to ice as she grasped the implications. Nothing beneficial came calling in such weather, especially with darkness falling and trouble already manifested in unpaid bills. Decent folk were gathered around their own fires, grateful for shelter and unwilling to venture out unless driven by desperation or malicious intent. Through swirling curtains of snow, she glimpsed a tall figure beside their barn, his horse drooping against the brutal wind. Both man and animal appeared nearly dead from exposure, but something in the stranger's posture gave her pause. He wasn't pressed against the building seeking opportunistic shelter, wasn't studying the house with calculating appraisal she'd learned to recognize in men who measured potential theft against expected resistance. Instead, he waited with dignity, intact, positioned respectfully distant, in ways suggesting someone who understood the difference between requesting assistance and demanding it. As Martha watched, a folded document fell from his coat, caught by wind, and pressed against a fence post where she could distinguish official text and what appeared to be Kelridge, embossed in formal lettering. Her stomach clenched with sudden recognition. What business could a drifter have with the banker threatening to destroy everything she'd fought to preserve? What coincidence brought a stranger carrying papers bearing her family's greatest enemy's name? Mama. Sarah's voice was thin as winter air. Someone's outside. Martha reached for James's Colt revolver, checking the cylinder with movements her husband had taught during their first brutal winter, when wolves grew bold and help remained impossible. 6 shots each, loaded with precision, that might determine the difference between her children's survival and destruction. "Stay from the windows," she commanded, voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "Keep quiet and stay back." She stepped onto the porch with the revolver ready, wind immediately slicing through her woolen shawl like Arctic blades. The cold transcended brutal, the kind that could kill through exposure in minutes. But she held position against whatever threat the storm had delivered. The stranger raised his hands immediately, palms visible despite driving snow. "Ma'am," he called, voice carrying rough edges of someone more accustomed to addressing animals than people. "Name's Cole Rivers. I'm not seeking trouble, just wondering if you might have work needing attention. I'll accept meals instead of wages." Cole Rivers. The name felt solid, carved from honest timber rather than shaped from smooth deceptions most drifters carried. Martha studied what she could see through swirling snow, noting careful positioning despite whatever hardships had brought him here during the season's worst storm. But her attention kept returning to that document trapped against the fence, fluttering like a wounded bird. The coincidence felt too deliberate, too perfectly timed for mere chance. Either this man connected to her problems in ways she couldn't understand, or fate had developed cruel timing. "What manner of work?" she asked, not lowering her weapon, but keeping it pointed groundward. "Whatever you require, ma'am. I'm capable with livestock carpentry, can repair most anything broken." He paused, and vulnerability crept into his voice. "Been traveling days without proper food or shelter? I'd count it genuine blessing to earn both through honest labor." Something in his speech reached past her defense's quality, suggesting authentic need rather than calculated manipulation. But Martha had learned caution with strangers, especially ones appearing during her family's darkest hour, carrying papers bearing her enemy's name. "There's a cot in the barn," she heard herself saying before prudence could intervene. "Water pumps by the back door, though, likely frozen solid. I'll have breakfast ready at sunrise if any of us survive this weather." Cole nodded, once gesture conveying more gratitude than elaborate speeches. "Much obliged, ma'am. You won't regret this decision." As he led his exhausted horse toward shelter, Martha retrieved the fallen document. Official federal court seals and legal language made her pulse quicken with mixed terror and optimism. She could distinguish fragments, something about improper foreclosure procedures, and a plaintiff named Cole Rivers seeking damages from Morton Kelridge. Inside, 3 pairs of worried eyes awaited explanation. Sarah's face carried anxiety belonging on someone thrice her age. Daniel tried appearing protective, despite youth hands clenched into fists, speaking of willingness to fight regardless of odds. Tommy pressed against the window, trying to glimpse this stranger who might represent salvation or disaster. "A man seeking work," Martha said, folding the paper into her apron pocket. "Claims his name is Cole Rivers." The document felt like a loaded weapon against her hip, something that might save or destroy them depending on usage. But as she prepared their sparse supper, she found herself entertaining possibilities she'd been too proud to pray for. For the first time in months, Martha Hayes allowed herself to believe tomorrow might bring something beyond another day of barely managed catastrophe. Dawn broke gray and bitter across the Montana territory, the storm having exhausted itself overnight and left everything buried under snow that gleamed like scattered jewels in pale morning light, struggling through heavy clouds, still threatening additional punishment. Profound silence followed the previous night's violence, broken only by distant cattle lowing and soft wind whispers through bare cottonwood sentinels marking their property boundaries. Martha rose before sunrise, as she had every morning since James's death, moving quietly through the kitchen to start coffee and begin daily rituals that kept her fragile world functioning despite chaos constantly threatening their precarious stability. Her breath remained visible despite banked coals in the cast-iron stove James had hauled from Fort Benton during their optimistic second year, reminding her that Montana winter was not merely a season, but a relentless adversary, requiring constant vigilance to survive its attempts to reclaim every scrap of civilization humans had carved from the wilderness. The kitchen held accumulated warmth from years of careful living, walls seasoned with smoke from countless meals, and comfortable patina from daily use by people who understood the value of everything they possessed. James's battered but functional coffee pot produced bitter brew that had sustained them through prosperity and hardship, while the wooden table he'd built during their first winter bore scars and stains from 2 decades of family meals, business discussions, and quiet moments that comprised the texture of a life lived in partnership with someone who shared dreams and determination to realize them. She was startled to see Cole Rivers already moving through the snow-covered yard with efficient purpose. Speaking of someone accustomed to early rising and demanding physical labor, he'd somehow cleared paths from barn to chicken coop, from there to the house, even to the well-creating safe walkways that would make necessary chores manageable rather than the dangerous struggles they'd become during recent weeks when her own strength hadn't sufficed for larger tasks, keeping a ranch operational. Steam rose from coffee he'd brewed over a small fire built with wood he must have gathered from their depleted supply, and she could see through the barn's open door that he'd already fed and watered their animals, checking each with careful attention James had rarely provided, even when alive and healthy. Their few remaining cattle stood in shelter he'd improvised, appearing more content than they had in weeks, while chickens pecked at grain, scattered with precision suggesting experience with livestock management. Through the kitchen window, she observed him work with growing fascination and relief she hadn't experienced since James's death. He moved like someone who'd spent his entire existence around animals, reading their needs and moods, in subtle signs most people missed entirely. Old Bessie, their milk cow, who'd been ornery and difficult since James's passing, stood calm and patient while Cole examined her hooves and udder with gentle hands, responding to his touch in ways that made Martha's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She could hear him speaking to the animals in low, soothing tones, carrying across the stillness like half-remembered melodies from when men's voices around the place had been common rather than precious. There was something deeply comforting about hearing masculine conversation again, even if directed toward livestock rather than humans, steady and unafraid of whatever work needed accomplishing, patient in ways James had never quite managed, despite his many other virtues as husband and father. The door burst open with enough force to rattle hinges, and Tommy barreled through with his small face bright with excitement she hadn't witnessed in months. Snow clung to his coat and mittens, evidence of early morning exploration, despite her instructions to remain warm and safe inside, until she could assess their visitor's intentions and character. Mama, he's already fixed the chicken coop door and cleared all the paths, and he says maybe I could help with repairs if I'm real careful and listen good to everything he tells me. Words tumbled out in an enthusiasm rush that made Martha's heart perform complicated movements between joy and terror. Can I help him, Mama, please? He said every ranch needs someone who understands how things work, and maybe I could learn to be that someone if I pay attention and work real hard. The optimism in Tommy's voice was almost unbearable to witness. Her youngest child had been starved for adult male attention since James's death, starved for someone to take his questions seriously and treat his curiosity as valuable rather than bothersome. James had loved the boy fiercely, but he'd been too busy trying to keep the ranch profitable, and the family fed to spend time teaching a 7-year-old skills and knowledge that might someday make him useful, rather than simply an additional mouth to feed. Stay out of his way, but you can watch and learn, Martha said, trying to keep relief from her voice, while simultaneously fighting back tears at seeing her son's face illuminate with pure joy that had been absent from their household for far too long. Mind your manners and do exactly what he tells you. Understand? I will, Mama, I promise. He's teaching me about how to tell if animals are healthy just by looking at them, and he says I've got good eyes for noticing things that matter. Nobody ever said I was good at noticing things before. The innocent observation was like a blade through Martha's chest. Tommy was a bright child, curious and observant. But in the chaos following James's death, none of them had possessed time or energy to nurture those qualities or help him understand that his questions and interests held value beyond their capacity to distract adults from more pressing concerns. Cole looked up as she approached with steaming coffee, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile, despite the early hour and cold that made every breath visible in the air between them. "Much obliged, ma'am. Didn't expect such fine service after the night we all endured." He accepted the cup with hands bearing scars and calluses of honest labor fingers, thick and strong from working with rope wire and stubborn animals that didn't always cooperate with human plans and schedules. Martha noticed he didn't drink immediately, just held the warmth and breathed the steam like someone who'd learned not to take simple pleasures for granted, like the luxury of hot coffee on a cold morning was something he'd almost forgotten existed during whatever travels had brought him to their door. "How long since you've had a proper breakfast?" She found herself asking, immediately regretting the personal question revealing more about her growing curiosity regarding his circumstances than was probably wise given how little she actually knew about him. "Been a considerable while." Cole admitted taking a careful sip that seemed to warm him from within. "This is excellent coffee, ma'am. Been drinking campfire brew and melted snow for so long, I'd almost forgotten what properly made coffee tastes like when someone knows what they're doing." He paused, looking toward the house where Sarah and Daniel were beginning to stir their voices, carrying faintly through cold air as they discussed necessary daily tasks and tried to determine whether their unexpected guest represented additional work or welcome assistance. "Your husband was a fortunate man to have built something so solid here. Good land, healthy animals, children who clearly understand the value of hard work and caring for what they've been given." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was entirely sure they should cross. Martha felt warmth rise in her cheeks, part embarrassment at the compliment, part something else she didn't want to examine too closely. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her, as if she were a woman with attractive qualities. Rather than simply a collection of problems and responsibilities, a long time since anyone had noticed the work she accomplished or acknowledged that it held value beyond immediate necessity. "He died 6 months ago," she said quietly, words coming more easily than they usually did when forced to explain their circumstances to strangers. "Fever took him fast over the course of just 3 days. Left us with more work than we can handle and debts that seem to grow like weeds no matter what we try to do about them." She hadn't meant to share so much personal information, but something about Cole's steady presence and obvious competence made the words spill out like water from a cracked dam. There was understanding in his dark eyes, recognition of loss, speaking of his own experiences with grief and disappointment, with the kind of pain that left permanent marks on a person's soul and changed how they looked at the world and their place within it. Cole nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed what she'd told him and seemed to weigh it against his own experiences and knowledge. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Losing a husband, losing a father, that's a heavy load for anyone to carry, especially with winter pressing hard and bills that won't wait for grief to pass or circumstances to improve." He looked toward the house where Daniel was emerging with determined steps, his thin shoulders squared in that heartbreaking attempt to appear older and more capable than his 12 years could possibly support. "Your children seem resilient, though. Strong. That speaks well of both their parents, of the foundation you built together before circumstances turned difficult." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes as she recognized the truth in his observation. James had been a good father in his way, loving and protective, when he remembered to pay attention to the children's daily needs and struggles. But he'd never quite known how to connect with their individual personalities and interests, the small moments and discoveries that comprised the texture of their developing lives. He'd been too focused on trying to make the ranch profitable, too worried about larger problems of market prices and weather patterns and the dozen other factors that could make or break a family's future in this challenging country. She'd often wished he could have seen what she saw in their children. Daniel's quiet intelligence and determination to learn everything possible about ranching despite his youth. Sarah's practical competence and growing wisdom about managing household responsibilities that would serve her well as an adult. Tommy's natural curiosity and instinctive affection for the animals they depended on for survival. James had loved them, but he'd never quite understood how to nurture the qualities that would make them successful adults, how to give them confidence and skills they would need to thrive in a world showing little mercy to the unprepared. Daniel, Cole called, as the boy approached with shoulders squared in that heartbreaking attempt to appear older and more capable than his 12 years. "Your mother tells me you've been managing the livestock since your father passed. Mind showing me your routine? I'd like to understand how things work around here before suggesting any changes that might interfere with systems already working well." The simple request, treating Daniel as someone with valuable knowledge rather than mistakes needing correction, transformed the boy's entire posture in ways that made Martha's breath catch with surprise and gratitude. His chest expanded with pride, and he launched into detailed explanations of feeding schedules and which animals needed special attention, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing minute. As Cole listened with focused attention, making every word seem important and worth considering carefully, Martha watched this interaction with growing amazement and relief that went deeper than simple gratitude for help with daily chores. In less than 10 minutes, Cole had accomplished something James, despite his love and good intentions, had never quite achieved, making Daniel feel important and respected. As a person whose opinions mattered, whose careful observations about animal behavior and ranch management were worth listening to and incorporating into larger decisions about how their operation should function. Her husband had always been too impatient to listen to a 12-year-old's explanations, too focused on getting things done quickly and efficiently, to appreciate the careful thought Daniel put into his responsibilities, or to recognize that the boy's questions often reflected genuine insight rather than simple curiosity. James had meant well, but he'd never understood that taking time to explain his reasoning and listen to alternative suggestions might actually improve their results while simultaneously building Daniel's confidence and expertise. "You've developed a solid system here," Cole told Daniel with the kind of seriousness one adult might show another when discussing important business matters. "I can see you've been thinking about what each animal needs, individually planning ahead for different seasons and conditions. That's the mark of someone who really understands ranching, who sees beyond just daily chores to the bigger picture of keeping everything healthy and productive over the long term." The transformation in Daniel was immediate and profound in ways that brought tears to Martha's eyes. His shoulders relaxed from their defensive hunch, his breathing steadied, and for the first time since his father's death, he looked like the confident, capable boy he'd been before grief and premature responsibility had aged him beyond his years and made him doubt his own judgment in matters where he actually possessed considerable knowledge and good instincts. Martha saw her son returning from the shadow of self-doubt that had been consuming him for months, returning to something like his natural self under the influence of an adult who recognized his worth and wasn't afraid to say so directly and specifically, rather than offering vague encouragement that children could see through immediately. Sarah appeared from the house, having finished morning chores of banking the fire and checking their food supplies, clearly uncertain whether to approach the stranger receiving such enthusiastic welcome from her younger brothers, or retreat to familiar tasks that didn't require interaction with unknown quantities. She moved with careful grace of someone who'd learned to make herself useful without drawing unnecessary attention to contribute to family welfare, without adding to anyone's burdens or concerns. Cole noticed her with the same focused attention he'd shown Daniel, his expression reflecting genuine appreciation for competence wherever he found it. "Miss Sarah, that's impressive organization I can observe through the window there. Everything arranged to make work flow efficiently while maintaining the kind of quality showing real pride in what you're accomplishing. Takes considerable skill to manage household responsibilities so well, especially under circumstances that would challenge someone with twice your experience. Sarah flushed with unexpected pleasure color, rising in her cheeks like roses blooming in winter. Compliments were rare in their survival-focused household, where every day was consumed by immediate necessities of keeping everyone fed and warm and safe. Where praise was a luxury they couldn't afford, when there was always more work to be done and never enough time or energy to accomplish it properly. The girl had grown accustomed to having her efforts taken for granted, her contributions valued only when they were absent, and their absence created problems that had to be solved by someone else. Mama taught me to do things properly. Sarah replied softly, but Martha could hear pride underneath the modesty pleasure at having her work noticed and appreciated by someone whose opinion clearly mattered to her for reasons she probably couldn't articulate. Doing things properly matters more than most people realize. Cole agreed with respect, suggesting he understood the difference between tasks performed adequately and tasks performed with attention to detail and long-term consequences. Shows respect for the work itself and for the people who depend on what you've accomplished. That kind of commitment to quality, that attention to getting things right, even when no one's watching, those aren't small things. They're the foundation everything else builds on. He turned to include Martha in the conversation, his dark eyes holding hers with intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. The sensation was both comforting and slightly overwhelming, like discovering that someone had been paying attention to details about her life that she'd assumed were invisible to everyone except herself. You've raised remarkable children, Mrs. Hayes. Strong, thoughtful, willing to work hard for what they care about, and smart enough to understand that quality matters more than speed when you're building something that needs to last. Their father would be proud of what you've accomplished together, of the way they've stepped up when circumstances required it, without losing their essential decency and kindness. The words hit Martha like a physical blow, but not a painful one. More like the shock of jumping into a cold stream on a hot day, startling, but ultimately refreshing and invigorating. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had praised her parenting, had noticed the efforts she made every day to keep her children not just physically healthy, but emotionally whole, despite circumstances that would have broken many families and left them scattered to the winds of an indifferent world. Tommy had been hovering at conversation edges, clearly wanting inclusion, but unsure how to insert himself into discussions that seemed too important and complex for a 7-year-old's participation. His small face was bright with curiosity and eagerness. But he'd learned to be patient when grown-ups were talking about serious matters that might affect the family's welfare in ways he couldn't fully understand. Cole noticed him with the same careful attention he'd paid to the older children, crouching down to the boy's level with patient kindness, suggesting he understood how important it was for children to feel valued and included, rather than simply tolerated until they were old enough to be genuinely useful. Tommy, isn't it? I could use assistance with some of this repair work I'm planning to tackle today. Think you might be interested in learning some carpentry skills? I've got tools that need someone with small, clever hands to help with detail work that gives men like me trouble. Tommy's face lit up like sunrise, breaking through storm clouds, his entire small body practically vibrating with excitement and eagerness that made Martha's heart swell with gratitude toward this stranger who seemed to understand exactly what her children needed to hear. Really? You'll teach me to use real tools like Papa used to promise he would? The innocent question carried weight of disappointment and longing that made Martha's chest tighten with sympathy for her youngest child. James had indeed promised to teach Tommy carpentry skills, had spoken often of projects they would tackle together when time allowed, when the ranch was more stable, when the boy was a little older and better able to handle dangerous tools safely. Those promises had been sincere, but vague, always postponed, until some future moment that never quite arrived, because there was always some more pressing concern demanding immediate attention. Of course I'll teach you. Cole said seriously, treating the boy's eagerness with the same respect he'd shown the older children's more sophisticated concerns. Every ranch needs someone who can fix things properly, and the best time to learn is when you're young and eager, and your hands are still nimble enough for finer work requiring precision rather than strength. The morning passed in a blur of productive activity that felt fundamentally different from their usual desperate scrambling to keep up with necessary tasks that never seemed to end. There was purpose in the work now direction that had been missing since James's death, left them without clear leadership or long-term planning. Cole moved through various projects with quiet efficiency, speaking of years of experience. But more importantly, he included all 3 children in the labor teaching as he went, asking for their opinions on problems and solutions, treating their contributions as valuable rather than simply tolerated. Martha found herself lingering in the yard, longer than necessary, making excuses to check on this project or that task. Unwilling to miss the sight of her children's faces bright with interest, and something that looked remarkably like joy. The sound of their laughter echoing across their property was like music she'd thought was lost forever, like the return of something essential that she hadn't realized was missing, until she heard it again. Daniel worked alongside Cole with growing confidence, his questions becoming more sophisticated as his understanding deepened, and his natural intelligence found appropriate outlets for expression. Sarah took charge of organizing supplies and managing smaller repairs with efficiency that impressed even Martha, who'd grown accustomed to her daughter's competence, but had never seen it recognized and praised by someone whose approval clearly meant something significant to the girl. Tommy shadowed Cole like a devoted apprentice, absorbing lessons about everything from tool care to animal behavior, with intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts containing secrets essential to his future success and contentment. The wooden whistle Cole carved for him during a brief break became a treasured possession symbol of patience and individual attention that had been missing from the boy's life since his father's death. For the first time in months, they looked like children instead of miniature adults crushed under responsibilities too large for their shoulders. For the first time since James's death, Martha heard genuine laughter filling their home and saw her family working together with shared purpose rather than individual desperation to survive whatever each day might bring. But it was during the midday meal that she began to understand the true depth of Cole's impact on her family's daily life and emotional well-being. What had been quiet, subdued affairs for months, meals eaten quickly and silently, while everyone worried about afternoon challenges and tried not to think too hard about how little food remained in their stores, suddenly became animated with chatter and genuine excitement about work they were accomplishing together. The children peppered Cole with questions about ranching techniques he'd learned in other places, about different animals he'd worked with, and various challenges he'd faced in different kinds of country, with different climates and conditions. They shared their own observations about their livestock, and land spoke of improvements they'd thought about, but never had confidence to attempt without adult guidance and approval. Cole answered every question with serious attention, treating their curiosity as natural and valuable, rather than interruption to adult concerns more important than childhood interests. He shared stories about successful ranches he'd worked on, techniques that had proven effective for solving problems, similar to ones they faced, always careful to explain his reasoning. So they understood not just what to do, but why particular approaches worked better than alternatives. Martha watched her family come alive around the table and felt something she'd almost forgotten. Existed pure, uncomplicated delight at seeing her children engaged with the world again. Seeing them remember that life could hold more than just survival and worry and constant struggle to make it through each day without losing ground to forces beyond their control. Yet even as she enjoyed this moment of unexpected normalcy, she couldn't shake awareness of the document hidden in her apron pocket and the legal papers suggesting Cole Rivers was more than just a helpful drifter who'd appeared at their door by fortunate coincidence. The questions that raised seemed to multiply every time she tried to think through implications of what she'd seen. And she knew that sooner or later she would have to find a way to raise the subject without seeming suspicious or ungrateful for the help he was providing. When the meal was finished and the children had dispersed to their various afternoon tasks, Martha found herself alone with Cole for the first time since his arrival. The moment felt significant, somehow weighted with possibilities that could reshape their entire situation. For better or worse, depending on how the conversation developed. "Mr. Rivers." She began carefully, then stopped as she realized she was unsure how to proceed without seeming either accusatory or desperate for information he might not be willing to share. Cole looked up from the harness repair he'd been working on, his weathered hands stilling as he gave her the same focused attention he'd shown her children throughout the morning. "Ma'am, I found something that fell from your coat last night," she said, producing the legal document with careful deliberation. "It seems to concern the same banker who holds our mortgage. That strikes me as quite a coincidence." Cole's expression grew carefully neutral. As he recognized the document, his entire demeanor shifting subtly from relaxed competence to guarded assessment of potential threats or opportunities. When he spoke, his voice carried weight of secrets that had been kept too long, of burdens shared only with himself for years of solitary travel. "You're right to be curious, ma'am. I haven't been entirely honest about why I came here, and you deserve to know the truth about my intentions." But before he could continue, Martha held up her hand, her own expression troubled in ways that made Cole's stomach tighten with apprehension. "There's something else, Mr. Rivers. Something that's been bothering me since I found that paper." She paused, seeming to struggle with whether to voice her concerns. "The timing of your arrival. The fact that you're carrying legal documents with Kelridge's name on them. It makes me wonder if perhaps you and he have some kind of arrangement I should know about." Cole's face went pale as he understood the implication of her words, realized that she suspected him of being in league with the very man he'd come to fight. "Mrs. Hayes, I can assure you that's not—" "I want to believe you." Martha interrupted, her voice carrying strain of someone who'd learned not to trust too easily. "But I have my children to think about, and I can't afford to make mistakes when their futures are at stake. So before we go any further, I need you to tell me exactly what your connection to Morton Kelridge is and why you're really here." The moment hung between them like a blade sharp with possibility for either revelation that would bring them closer together or misunderstanding that would drive them irreparably apart. The confession that followed shattered the careful barriers Cole had constructed around his past, spilling out with the force of a dam bursting under pressure too great to contain any longer. He set down the leatherwork completely and looked directly into Martha's eyes with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her wariness. "I knew about your situation before I ever knocked on your door," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of admission and vulnerability that came with exposing secrets he'd carried for years. "But not because I'm working with Kelridge, because I'm working against him." Martha felt her breath catch as understanding began to dawn, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue with what was clearly a difficult revelation. 3 years ago, I had my own spread about 50 miles south of here." Cole began, his weathered face reflecting pain that was still raw despite the passage of time. "Nothing grand, but it was mine, built with these hands stocked with cattle I'd worked years to afford. My wife Sarah and our son Daniel lived there with me." The coincidence of names made Martha's eyes widen, but she said nothing as Cole struggled with memories that were clearly difficult to revisit. "When fever came to our area, it burned through settlements like wildfire consuming dry grass. Took my Sarah first, then Daniel 3 days later. I was barely functional by the time they were both in the ground, couldn't work, couldn't think clearly enough to handle the kind of business that keeps a ranch operating." His hands clenched into fists as old anger surfaced. "That's when Morton Kelridge moved in like the scavenger he is. Claimed I'd missed payments during my grief, said the bank couldn't carry delinquent mortgages when they had responsibilities to investors. Foreclosed while I was still trying to figure out how to live without everyone I'd ever loved." Martha stared at him, pieces of a larger picture beginning to form in her mind. The court judgment you fought him. Federal court ruled his foreclosure procedures violated territorial law regarding proper notification during family emergencies. Cole said, his smile grim with satisfaction. Awarded me substantial damages enough to buy back my original property twice over and still have money left for improvements. But you didn't buy it back? Martha asked, though she was beginning to understand. Couldn't bear the thought of living where I'd buried everyone I loved. Cole admitted. So I carried that judgment like a weapon, waiting for the right moment to use it against the man who destroyed my family's future. Martha felt a complex mixture of emotions washing through her: relief that he wasn't in league with Kelridge's gratitude for his desire to help, but also concern about being used as a pawn in someone else's revenge. And that moment is now seemed like justice, Cole replied. Kelridge profited from my family's destruction, so maybe it was time to help save someone else's family from the same fate. There's more, isn't there? Martha said, studying his face. I can see it in your eyes. Cole was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I knew your husband, Martha. Not well, but our paths crossed several times over the years. About 15 years ago, I was working a cattle drive in Texas when we hit flash flooding. River rose faster than anyone could predict, caught several of us in the middle of a crossing. Martha's breath caught as recognition dawned. I went under and thought I was finished. Cole continued. But someone saw me go down and came after me, risked his own life to pull a stranger out of water that could have killed us both. James, she whispered. James Hayes. Cole confirmed. Never forgot that debt. When I heard his widow was in trouble, it seemed like maybe I'd found a way to repay what I owed him. The revelation recontextualized everything: his gentleness with the children, his obvious concern for their welfare, his willingness to risk confrontation with dangerous men. This wasn't random kindness, but deliberate action by someone honoring a debt that had shaped his entire life. But before Martha could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation with sharp urgency. Through the paths Cole had cleared, they could see two riders emerging from the tree line at a pace suggesting business that wouldn't wait for convenient timing. Martha's stomach clenched as she recognized Morton Kelridge, despite the distance, his stiff posture unmistakable even from far away. His companion remained mounted with the alert posture of someone accustomed to violence, hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. It's him, Martha whispered, fear evident in her voice. It's Kelridge. Cole's expression hardened as he took in the approaching riders, his entire demeanor shifting from vulnerable confession to tactical assessment. Get the children inside. Whatever happens, keep them away from the windows until it's over. But Martha was already shaking her head. No, this is my ranch, my family. If you're going to use your judgment against him, then I'm going to be there when you do it. Cole looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression convinced him that resistance would be futile. Then we face this together. But Martha, let me handle the legal aspects. I've been planning this for 3 years. As they reached the house, Martha called for her children, while Cole positioned himself where he could observe the approaching riders. The children gathered with quick obedience, understanding the gravity of the situation from their parents' faces. What's happening? Sarah asked. Mr. Kelridge has come to discuss our mortgage. Martha replied carefully. Mr. Rivers is going to help us negotiate better terms. Through the window, she watched the banker and his companion dismount. Even at this distance, Kelridge's face was flushed with anger, suggesting he'd come here already committed to a course of action that wouldn't be easily swayed by reasonable discussion. Cole stepped onto the porch with easy confidence. But Martha noticed the subtle signs of preparation and the way his hand hovered near his weapon and the careful positioning that would give him tactical advantages if words failed to resolve their differences. What happened next would determine everything. Whether her children grew up on the land their father had loved, whether the connection growing between her and Cole would have a chance to develop into something deeper, whether justice would finally be served to a man who profited from others' misery for far too long. The battle began not with bullets, but with words sharp as blades, each man wielding language like a weapon honed for maximum damage. Morton Kelridge approached with the arrogant stride of someone accustomed to intimidating desperate people into submission, while his hired gun remained mounted in a position offering tactical advantages should diplomacy fail to achieve their employer's goals. Mrs. Hayes. Kelridge called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy that made Martha's skin crawl. I hope you don't mind this unexpected visit, but I was troubled by your continued failure to meet your mortgage obligations. My investors are growing impatient with borrowers who seem unable to honor their commitments. The threat was wrapped in politeness, but Martha could hear the underlying menace clearly. She felt her children press closer, drawing strength from each other, as they sensed the danger in this confrontation. Cole stepped forward with measured confidence, but Martha noticed how his entire body had shifted into readiness. Good morning, Morton. Don't believe we've had the pleasure of a proper introduction. Cole Rivers. The casual use of the banker's first name was a deliberate provocation, establishing Cole as someone who refused to show the deference Kelridge expected from people he considered his inferiors. The effect was immediate. Kelridge's face cycled through recognition calculation and growing fury. I don't know what you're talking about, Kelridge said, but his voice had already lost its confident edge. Cole reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, producing the legal document. Federal District Court judgment. Seems your foreclosure procedures 3 years ago weren't quite legal. Court awarded me substantial damages for your misconduct. Kelridge's mounted companion leaned down to examine the document, his expression changing as he processed its contents. What's it say, Mr. Kelridge? Something in the gunman's weathered voice made Martha look at him more closely. There was something familiar about his features, something that nagged at her memory. It says nothing that matters. Kelridge snapped, desperation creeping into his voice. Ancient legal technicalities, actually. Cole said mildly, I think it's very current. I've been waiting 3 years for the right moment to collect what you owe me. Seems like now might be that time unless we can reach an arrangement regarding Mrs. Hayes's mortgage. But Kelridge had reached his breaking point. His face contorted with rage as he realized his scheme was collapsing. I don't negotiate with drifters who think they can threaten legitimate businessmen. His hand moved toward his coat, and Martha saw the glint of metal. The world crystallized into deadly clarity as Cole's revolver appeared with practiced speed. But the mounted gunman was faster, his weapon clearing leather with fluid precision. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, the 3 men faced each other across 10 yards of snow-covered ground, with weapons drawn. Martha could see the tactical situation. With terrifying clarity, wind was picking up again, driving snow that would affect visibility and accuracy. The fence posts provided minimal cover, and the confined space left little room for maneuvering. Then the mounted man spoke, and his words changed everything. Cole Rivers, he said slowly. I'll be damned. You're the man who pulled James Hayes from that flood in Texas. Recognition hit Martha like lightning. Frank Morrison, one of James's old riding partners. She hadn't seen him in years, but there was no mistaking those features. Frank, she whispered in disbelief. Morrison grinned, his weapon still drawn, but no longer aimed with deadly intent. Hello, Martha. When Kelridge hired me for this collection visit, I never expected to find the man who saved James's life. Kelridge looked between his hired gun and Cole with growing panic. You know each other. Know each other. Frank laughed. This is the man James never stopped talking about. The stranger who risked everything to save him from drowning. Martha stared at Cole in amazement as the final pieces clicked into place. James had told her about the flood many times, but she'd never imagined that Hero was standing in her yard. But Kelridge had reached his limit. Cornered and desperate, he made the choice that would define the next few crucial minutes. If I can't have this ranch, he snarled. "Nobody can." His weapon swung toward Martha with deadly intent. The distance was less than 10 yards, impossible to miss. But the swirling snow caught his vision just as he pulled the trigger, and a gust of wind sent crystals directly into his face. The shot went wide, splintering wood from the barn wall. Cole's return fire was immediate and devastatingly accurate, his bullet taking Kelridge in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Frank Morrison's weapon boomed simultaneously, his shot catching the banker in the leg to ensure he wouldn't be getting up to continue his murder attempt. Then Tommy's voice cut through the gunpowder smoke like a blade through silk. "Don't hurt anyone else," the 7-year-old cried, running from the house despite earlier instructions. "We're good people. We just want to keep our home." The child's simple courage seemed to drain the violence from the moment. Even Frank Morrison looked ashamed as he stared down at the boy, who'd placed himself between armed men with nothing but innocent determination. "Easy, son," Frank said, gently holstering his weapon. "Nobody else is getting hurt today." Kelridge lay groaning in the rapidly reddening snow, his scheme collapsed completely. Frank dismounted to tend his wounds with rough competence. "Oh, damn fool," Frank muttered. "Always did let greed overcome sense." Cole was already checking on Martha and the children. "Everyone all right?" Martha nodded, though she was shaking with reaction. "You saved us." Again, Cole's expression softened. That's what family does for each other. The word hung between them, with more meaning than any formal declaration. Family, not strangers bound by convenience, but people who'd chosen to stand together, regardless of the cost. Frank finished binding Kelridge's wounds. "He'll live, though his banking days are finished." Amazing how fast word travels when a man tries to murder a widow and her children. As they prepared to transport Kelridge to town, Frank paused beside Martha. "James would be proud. Proud of how you've kept his family together, proud of the man who's chosen to stand with you." The immediate crisis was over. But Martha knew the larger questions of their future still needed resolution. What mattered now was that they would face those challenges together, united by bonds tested in violence and proven unbreakable. 1 week later, Martha stood in her kitchen watching Cole teach Tommy proper knife techniques, while Sarah helped Daniel plan water system improvements. The domestic scene filled her with contentment she thought was lost forever. A familiar knock brought Frank Morrison's weathered face into view, carrying a leather satchel that seemed to contain their entire future. "Morning, folks," he said, accepting coffee gratefully. "Brought news you'll want to hear." He opened the satchel and spread documents across their table with ceremonial care. Kelridge's employers weren't pleased when the full story reached them. Attempted murder tends to be bad for a bank's reputation. Martha felt her knees weaken as implications sank in. "They're transferring your mortgage to Helena First National Institution, known for working with families rather than against them. Payment terms that make sense, interest rates that won't strangle you." He pointed to specific documents. "Better yet, Cole's federal judgment covers your entire outstanding balance, plus penalties. Court ordered full restitution, and your situation qualified for complete debt forgiveness." Cole turned with deep satisfaction. Sometimes justice finds its way, even when it takes longer than anyone prefers. Tommy looked up from his whittling practice. "Does this mean we get to keep our home? Does this mean Mr. Cole doesn't have to leave?" The innocent questions cut straight to what everyone was thinking. Daniel voiced what mattered most. "Mr. Cole, are you planning to stay permanently?" Cole's expression grew thoughtful as he looked around the kitchen that had become more home than anywhere he'd lived since losing his family. "I can't speak for your mother's feelings, but if she's willing, I'd like to make this arrangement permanent. Not just as hired help, but as someone who belongs here." Sarah looked between the adults with barely contained excitement. "Are you asking Mama to marry you?" The direct question made Martha's heart race with possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. "I suppose I am," Cole said quietly, vulnerability clear in his weathered face. If she thinks a man with more scars than savings might be worthy of the honor. Martha felt tears streaming as she absorbed the moment she'd hoped for without believing it possible. "Cole Rivers, I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a partner in raising these children and working this land." "Yes, absolutely yes." The kitchen erupted in celebration. Tommy whooped and hugged Cole's legs. Daniel grinned with relief. Sarah clapped with romantic satisfaction. Frank watched with contentment. James would be proud. Proud of how his family survived, proud of the man who's chosen to care for them. The legal formalities were completed efficiently. Frank's influence, combining with Cole's judgment to create resolution satisfying everyone, except the man who'd caused their problems. Kelridge would face criminal charges and civil penalties, his reputation destroyed throughout the territory. But more important than legal victories were the personal ones that followed. Martha and Cole began planning a wedding, discussing arrangements with the easy compatibility of people who'd proven they could work together under the most stressful circumstances. The children threw themselves into preparations. Daniel peppered Cole with questions about advanced techniques. Sarah organized household tasks with renewed energy. Tommy simply attached himself to Cole whenever possible. As winter gradually loosened its grip and spring appeared in longer days and warmer temperatures, Martha found herself on the porch in lengthening evening light, watching Cole work with her children on improvements that would serve them through coming seasons. The sight filled her with peace she'd thought was impossible after James's death. Now she could see a future extending beyond survival, filled with shared work and mutual support and love that grew stronger through testing rather than weaker through taking for granted. Cole caught her watching and smiled, the expression that had become necessary to her happiness as breathing. He joined her, taking her hand with gentle possessiveness. "Any regrets?" He asked their private ritual for acknowledging how completely their lives had changed. Martha leaned into his strength, breathing in the scent of honest work and kept promises. "Only one. I wish James could see how everything turned out, could know his children are safe, and that his sacrifice led to their security." Cole's arm tightened around her. "I think he knows. That flood 15 years ago, his choice to risk everything for a stranger, I think it was all connected to this moment, bringing us together when we needed each other most." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children work with easy cooperation, speaking of bonds deeper than blood, forged through shared struggle, and maintained through daily choices to support each other. In the distance, wagon wheels on the main road caught their attention. Martha felt Cole tense with old reflexes, but as travelers came into view, she could see they were clearly a family, parents and children, who looked exhausted and worried, carrying desperate optimism she remembered from her own darkest moments. "Think they might need assistance?" she asked, knowing Cole's answer. Cole's smiled expression warm with memories of another storm when desperate people found shelter they couldn't locate elsewhere. "Let's find out." Together, they walked toward the road, ready to offer help to strangers who might be carrying troubles too heavy to bear alone, ready to pay forward the kindness that had saved them all. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with warm lamplight, welcoming and secure, a place where broken things could be mended and lost souls could find their way home, where families could grow to include not just those born into them, but those chosen and embraced as if they'd always belonged. The wind carried scents of growing things and promises of harvest of dreams, taking root in soil, enriched by struggles and sacrifices of those who'd refused to surrender when circumstances seemed impossible. Above them, stars appeared in their eternal dance, witnessing small miracles that happened daily in lives of ordinary people who chose to help each other find their way from darkness toward light. As they reached the approaching travelers and began conversations that would determine whether their miracle might be shared, Martha felt deep satisfaction that came from understanding her place in the great chain of kindness connecting one heart to another, until compassion spread across the earth like seeds scattered by generous hands. Understanding the value of planting for harvests they might never see, but which would nourish generations yet to come. This was how healing happened and love multiplied, not through being hoarded, but through being shared, not through being protected, but through being offered freely to those who needed it most. This was how families expanded beyond blood ties, to embrace chosen companions who proved their worth through loyalty and daily choices, to stand together against whatever storms might threaten their shared peace. This was home in its truest sense. Not just a place marked by boundaries, but a state of being where people belonged to each other and were willing to prove that belonging through actions speaking louder than words or promises or any other form of declaration. This was worth every struggle it had taken to find every risk they'd accepted, to preserve every sacrifice they'd made, to build something beautiful and lasting from raw materials of courage, determination, and love that refused to be defeated by circumstances or diminished by time's passage.